The airport was already alive with noise when I walked through the sliding glass doors. Suitcases rolled across the shiny floor. Announcements echoed through the high ceilings, and the smell of coffee floated from a nearby cafe. People hurried past me with excited expressions, hugging family members goodbye or rushing to catch flights. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. I tightened my grip on my passport and walked toward the airline counter. This trip mattered more than anyone around me could possibly understand. For most people, it was just another flight. For me, it felt like the beginning of a completely different life. The line moved slowly, giving my mind too much time to wander. I thought about the dinner the night before. The way my mom had stared at me across the table, like I was personally insulting her just by existing. "You're really leaving tomorrow?" she had asked, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Yes," I replied calmly. "I told you last week." Emma, my older sister, had been sitting beside her fiancé, smiling smugly like she always did when our mother turned her attention toward me. "But Emma's engagement celebration is tomorrow night," Mom said. "The whole family will be there." "I know," I said. "But I have an important meeting." Emma laughed softly and sipped her wine. "A meeting," she repeated. "Right?" Mom shook her head. "With who?" "Your imaginary tech friends." The table erupted with laughter. Even my uncle chuckled. I had sat there quietly, staring down at my plate. I had learned years ago that defending myself never helped. It only gave them more reason to mock me. Now, standing in the airport line, I tried to push the memory away. This meeting wasn't imaginary. It was the biggest meeting of my life. And if everything went well, it would finalize a deal that had taken 3 years of sleepless nights, coding marathons, investor pitches, and endless work. The line moved forward and soon I was standing at the counter. The airline employee smiled politely. "Passport, please." I handed it to her and placed my carry-on bag on the scale. My heart was beating a little faster than normal. Not from fear, just anticipation. She typed something into her computer. Then she frowned. The typing stopped. She clicked a few more things on the screen, then looked up at me with a confused expression. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Your ticket has been cancelled." For a moment, I thought I had heard her wrong. "Cancelled?" I asked. "That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is," she said gently. "It was cancelled early this morning." My stomach tightened. "That doesn't make sense," I said. "I booked it 2 weeks ago." She turned her monitor slightly toward me. "According to the system, it was cancelled by the account holder." The account holder. A cold feeling crept down my spine. I already knew the answer before I even checked my phone. My screen lit up right on cue, a text message. From Mom. My chest tightened as I opened it. "Have fun walking home, loser." For a long moment, the world around me seemed to fade into the background. The airport noise, the rolling suitcases, the announcements over the speakers, it all blurred into distant static. I just stared at those 5 words. Walking home, from the airport, which was almost 15 miles away. It was exactly the kind of cruel joke my mother loved. Embarrass me, humiliate me, remind me where I stood in the family hierarchy. And apparently she thought it was hilarious. The airline employee watched my face carefully. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I forced a small smile. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Just a misunderstanding." But it wasn't a misunderstanding. My mother had always made it clear what she thought of me. Growing up, Emma had been the perfect daughter. Straight A's, cheerleader, popular, beautiful. My mom loved showing her off at every family gathering. Emma would walk into the room and my mother would practically glow with pride. But when people asked about me, my mother's tone always changed. "Oh, her," she would say with a shrug. "She's the weird one." Everyone would laugh. "She just sits in her room all day with that computer." I still remembered one Thanksgiving when my aunt asked what I wanted to do when I grew up. Before I could answer, my mom had laughed and said, "Probably live in my basement forever." The entire table laughed like it was the funniest joke they had ever heard. Except me. Because the truth was, those long hours in front of my computer weren't laziness. They were work, learning, building. 3 years ago, during one of those endless nights, I had started building something small. Just a program that analyzed financial patterns faster than traditional tools. At first it was just curiosity. Then it started getting attention online. Then investors started emailing. Then everything changed. But my family never noticed. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to ask. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Mom. Maybe now you'll learn not to embarrass me. Embarrass her. I frowned. Then the memory clicked into place. At dinner the night before, she had been furious that I wasn't staying for Emma's engagement party. Apparently choosing my own life over her plans was an act of betrayal. So this was her punishment. Cancel the ticket. Strand me. Make sure I knew my place. The airline employee cleared her throat gently. Would you like to rebook your flight? I looked up at her. For a moment, I felt the old emotions rising again. The humiliation, the anger, the familiar feeling of being the family failure. Then something else replaced it. Calm. Because unlike the girl my family thought I was, I knew exactly who I had become. Slowly, I reached into my bag and pulled out my wallet. Yes, I said. The woman nodded. Let me check availability. While she typed, I glanced around the airport again. People rushing to their gates. Families hugging goodbye. Business travelers typing on laptops. None of them had any idea that my mother had just tried to humiliate me in the middle of the airport. And none of them had any idea how wrong she was about me. The employee looked up again. There's a seat available on the next flight, she said. Perfect. And the price for that seat is… Before she could finish, I slid a sleek black card across the counter. Her eyes flicked down to it, then back up at me. Not with judgment, with quiet surprise. People who looked like me, simple clothes, old backpack, messy ponytail, didn't usually pay for expensive flights without hesitation. But she didn't ask questions. She simply started typing again. And for the first time that morning, I smiled. The airline employee's eyebrows lifted slightly when she saw the black card resting on the counter. It wasn't the kind of card people pulled out casually. Especially not someone dressed as simply as I was. I could see the momentary curiosity in her eyes, but to her credit, she didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and began typing again. Let me see what we have available, she said politely. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. I stood quietly, the noise of the airport swirling around me again, now that the shock of my mother's message had faded. Somewhere behind me, a child was crying. A group of college students laughed loudly while dragging oversized suitcases past the line. An announcement echoed over the speakers about a delayed flight to Chicago. Life was continuing normally for everyone else. The employee glanced up again. There's a seat available on the next flight, she said. How soon? I asked. Boarding begins in about an hour. That's perfect. She gave a small nod and continued typing. A few seconds later, the small printer beside her screen began spitting out a new boarding pass. She slid it across the counter along with my passport. You're all set. Thank you, I said sincerely. As I picked up my things, my phone buzzed again. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. But when I checked the screen, it wasn't my mother this time. It was Emma. I hesitated for a moment before opening the message. Mom said you caused a huge scene at the airport. I stared at the words, then let out a quiet breath through my nose. A scene. I hadn't even raised my voice. Another message appeared before I could respond. You really need to grow up. Mom only canceled it because you were being selfish. Selfish. That word had followed me my entire life. Selfish for studying instead of socializing. Selfish for not attending every family gathering. Selfish for building something they didn't understand. I typed slowly. Don't worry about me. I handled it. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Handled it how? You can't even afford your own flights. I stared at the message for a moment. Then I laughed softly under my breath. It wasn't an angry laugh. It was the kind of laugh you give when someone is so confidently wrong that correcting them almost feels pointless. Emma had always believed she understood me. In her mind, I was still the awkward younger sister hiding in her bedroom with a laptop. The one everyone joked about. The one who would never be as successful or popular as her. The funny part was, I had never actually tried to compete with her. While she focused on popularity and appearances, I focused on building something real. Instead of replying, I slipped my phone back into my bag. Some truths didn't need to be explained. I walked toward the security checkpoint and joined another line of travelers waiting to scan their bags. The process was slow, but I didn't mind. For the first time in years, I felt strangely calm. Not because of the money, but because something inside me had shifted. For most of my life, I had tried to prove something to my family. I worked harder, studied longer, built more things, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same pride they showed Emma. But that moment never came. And somewhere along the way, I realized something important. Their approval wasn't a requirement for my success. By the time I finished security and made my way to the first-class lounge, the tension from earlier had almost completely faded. The lounge was quiet compared to the rest of the airport. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and the low murmur of people speaking politely over coffee and laptops. I found an empty seat near the window and sat down. Outside, airplanes moved slowly across the runway like giant metal birds preparing to take flight. I ordered a coffee and leaned back in the chair. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself to breathe. My phone rang again. This time it really was my mother. Her name flashed across the screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it. But curiosity won. I answered. "What?" She snapped before I could even say hello. Her voice sounded irritated, like she had been waiting for me to call, and was annoyed that I hadn't. "You didn't come crawling home yet," she continued. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. "No," I said calmly. "Well, good," she said. "Maybe walking a few miles will knock some sense into you." I watched a plane slowly pull away from the terminal. "Actually," I said, "I'm boarding soon." There was a pause. "What?" I rebooked the flight. "With what money?" she scoffed. "Your imaginary tech job." I smiled slightly. "Something like that?" She snorted. "You're pathetic," she said. "Always pretending you're important." The old version of me might have argued. Might have tried to defend myself. But now the words barely touched me. She had already decided who I was years ago. Nothing I said would change that. "Anyway," she continued, "don't bother coming to Emma's wedding if you're going to keep acting like this." I raised an eyebrow. "Acting like what?" "Like you're better than us." For a moment, the irony almost made me laugh. She had spent years treating me like I was beneath everyone. Now the moment I stood up for myself, she thought I believed I was superior. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," I said calmly. I paused for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "But I do know my worth." There was a short silence on the other end. Then she scoffed again. "Sure you do." And just like that, she hung up. I slowly lowered the phone and placed it on the table. Around me, the quiet lounge continued as if nothing had happened. A businessman typed rapidly on his laptop. A couple sat near the bar sharing a plate of pastries. A flight attendant walked past carrying a tray of drinks. Normal life. Peaceful. I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip. Soon my flight would board. Soon I would be heading to the most important meeting of my career. And soon, whether they liked it or not, my family was going to learn something. Underestimating someone doesn't make them small. Sometimes it just means you weren't paying attention when they started rising. The meeting room overlooked the San Francisco skyline, a wide wall of glass stretching from floor to ceiling. Sunlight spilled across the long conference table, where a group of lawyers, investors, and executives sat flipping through thick stacks of paperwork. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. 6 hours earlier I had walked into the building with my laptop and a quiet sense of determination. Now, I sat near the end of the table listening to two lawyers discuss the final wording of a clause that would officially complete a deal that had been years in the making. My company. My software. The thing everyone back home thought was a silly hobby. I folded my hands in front of me and listened as the lead attorney adjusted her glasses. "If everyone is satisfied with the revisions," she said, "we can finalize the acquisition agreement." Across the table, one of the executives nodded. "We're ready." The lawyer slid a document toward me. "This is the final signature page." For a moment I just looked at it. 3 years of work. Endless nights of coding. Investor meetings that lasted until midnight. Moments where I almost gave up because the pressure felt too heavy. And now everything came down to a single signature. I picked up the pen. My hand moved slowly but confidently as I signed my name. The paper was passed around the table as others added their signatures. The moment the last pen touched paper, the lawyer smiled. "Congratulations," she said. "The acquisition is complete." One of the executives leaned back in his chair with a satisfied breath. "Your software is going to change the way financial firms analyze market patterns," he said. "You built something incredible." I nodded politely. "Thank you." But strangely, I didn't feel the explosion of excitement people often expect in moments like this. It felt quieter than that. Calmer. Like standing on a mountaintop after a long climb. The journey had been exhausting, but reaching the top felt peaceful rather than dramatic. Another lawyer leaned forward with a tablet. "The wire transfer should already be processing." A few seconds later, my phone buzzed. I picked it up and opened my banking app. For a brief second I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I counted the zeros again. 78,000 zalozen. $78 million. The number sat there calmly on the screen, almost unreal. Not because of greed or excitement, but because it represented every late night, every line of code, every moment people told me I was wasting my time. All of it had turned into something real. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and shook hands with the people around the table. Everyone congratulated each other, while assistants gathered the paperwork. Eventually the room began to empty. My lawyer approached me with a warm smile. "You handled that meeting extremely well," she said. "I've had practice," I replied. She laughed softly. "Still, not many people your age manage negotiations like that." I shrugged slightly. "When people underestimate you, it's easier to surprise them." She nodded thoughtfully. "Well, today surprised a lot of people." After the final goodbyes, I left the building and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. San Francisco buzzed with life around me. Cars rolled down the busy streets. Pedestrians crossed intersections, and the distant sound of cable cars echoed through the city. For a moment, I just stood there. 3 years ago I had been sitting in my childhood bedroom writing code on an old laptop. Now I had just completed a multi-million-dollar acquisition. Life had changed faster than I ever expected. Later that evening I checked into my hotel and dropped my bag near the bed. My body felt heavy with exhaustion from the long meeting. But my mind was still running through everything that had happened. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally looked at my phone again. 23 unread messages. Most of them from family. That alone was unusual. My family rarely contacted me unless they needed something. I opened the first message. "Emma, why are investors calling you the founder of Axiom Analytics?" My eyebrows lifted slightly. Then I opened the next message. Also from Emma. "The article says you sold the company." My stomach tightened slightly. I opened the link she had sent. A tech news website appeared on the screen. Right at the top was a photo of me taken during a conference months earlier. The headline read, "Young developer sells financial analytics startup in 120M deal." Below it was a short article explaining the acquisition, the technology behind the software, and the story of how a quiet programmer had built a platform that caught the attention of major financial firms. Near the middle of the article was a sentence that made my phone buzz again with another message. According to the report, the founder's personal share of the deal is estimated at $78 million. I leaned back slowly against the headboard. So that's how they found out. More messages kept arriving. "Emma again. Is this real?" Then my mother. "Is this some kind of joke?" Another message. "Why didn't you tell us about this?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. 3 years. 3 years of work. 3 years where none of them had once asked what I was building, and now they were suddenly very interested. My phone started ringing. "Mom." Her name flashed brightly across the screen. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I answered. Her voice sounded completely different from earlier that morning. Not angry, not mocking, confused. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked immediately. I leaned back against the pillows. "You never asked." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then she cleared her throat. "Well, we just saw the article." I figured. "You sold a company?" she asked.
Yes.
"For 78 million, approximately." Another long pause followed. When she spoke again her tone had changed. It was softer now, careful. You should come home, she said. We should celebrate. Celebrate. The word almost made me laugh. Just hours earlier she had cancelled my ticket and told me to walk home. Now she wanted to celebrate. With the family, she added quickly. I stared at the ceiling for a moment. Years ago I would have jumped at the chance to hear those words. To feel like they were proud of me. But something inside me had shifted. Now the invitation fell. I'm busy, I said calmly. With what? She asked. With the transition process for the company. Another pause. Then her voice softened even more. You know, families should support each other. I closed my eyes for a moment. For years I had wanted to hear her say that, but the timing made it painfully clear what had changed. It wasn't their perspective of me. It was the number in my bank account. I agree, I said quietly. And support should go both ways. She didn't respond, because we both knew the truth. For my entire life, it never had. When I decided to go home 2 weeks later, it wasn't because my family had suddenly become important again. It wasn't because my mother kept calling, or because Emma had sent several awkward messages asking when I would visit. The truth was simpler than that. I went back because there were things I needed to say, and some chapters in life can't truly close until you face the people who wrote the first pages. The drive from the airport to the house felt strangely familiar and distant at the same time. Every street held a memory. The grocery store, where Mom used to brag about Emma's cheerleading trophies. The small park where I used to sit with my laptop after school because it was quieter than the house. The coffee shop where I had spent months working on early versions of the program that would eventually become my company. Back then, no one believed any of it mattered. Now it mattered a lot. When I turned into the driveway of the house I grew up in, I noticed the curtains in the front window move slightly. Someone had been watching for me. I barely had time to step out of the car before the front door swung open. My mother hurried outside. For a moment I almost didn't recognize the expression on her face. It was bright and eager, the kind of smile she usually saved for guests she wanted to impress. There you are, she said, walking quickly toward me. Before I could react, she wrapped her arms around me in a tight hug. The sudden contact caught me off guard. My mother hadn't hugged me like that in years. Not since I was a teenager. We're so proud of you, she said warmly. Her voice sounded almost emotional, but something about the moment felt wrong. Not fake exactly, just delayed. I stood there stiffly for a second before gently pulling back. Inside the house, the air smelled the same as it always had. A mixture of candles and the faint scent of old furniture polish. The living room looked almost identical to how I remembered it, except now there were wedding magazines scattered across the coffee table. Emma sat at the kitchen table with her fiancé, Daniel. When she saw me walk in, she stood quickly. Hey, she said, giving me a small, uncertain smile. Daniel looked at me with obvious curiosity. So, Emma said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The article said 78 million. I nodded once. Her fiancé let out a low whistle. That's insane. My mother hurried into the kitchen behind me and immediately began talking. We've just been so shocked, she said. We had no idea you were doing something so successful. I leaned against the kitchen counter quietly. Emma folded her hands together on the table. You built that whole company yourself? Mostly, I said. Whoa. For a moment the room fell into an awkward silence. Then my mother cleared her throat. Well, she said carefully, since you're doing so well now. I watched her expression closely. There it was. The shift. The real reason the house suddenly felt warmer than it ever had before. We were actually thinking, she continued, that maybe you could help out with a few things. Emma straightened in her chair. My wedding is coming up soon, she added quickly. And weddings are expensive, Mom said with a sympathetic smile. Daniel nodded like this was the most reasonable conversation in the world. We had a venue picked out, Emma said. But it's a little outside our budget. Mom jumped back in. But if you wanted to contribute, we could still make it happen. I didn't respond, so they kept going. And the house needs some repairs, Mom continued. The roof is getting old. Emma nodded eagerly. And maybe we could upgrade the catering for the wedding, Daniel added. And the honeymoon would be amazing if we could extend it. And your cousin is starting college soon, Mom said quickly. You could help with her tuition. The requests began stacking up one after another like a shopping list. They spoke casually, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if the past 25 years hadn't happened. Finally, I raised a hand slightly. The room went quiet. Mom blinked. What? I looked around the kitchen. At the same table where my mother had once joked that I would live in her basement forever. At the same chairs where Emma had laughed every time I tried to talk about the projects I was building. I took a slow breath. I'll help, I said. The reaction was immediate. Emma's face lit up. Daniel grinned. Mom clapped her hands together happily. Oh, that's wonderful, she said. But, I added calmly. The excitement in the room froze. But only under one condition. Mom frowned slightly. What condition? I looked directly at her. I want an apology. The room went completely silent. Emma's smile slowly faded. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom crossed her arms. For what? She asked. For canceling my ticket, I said. Her expression hardened. For calling me a loser? No one spoke. For spending years treating me like I was worthless. Emma looked down at the table. Daniel stared at the floor. But my mother's face turned cold. That was just joking, she said. I shook my head slowly. No, I replied. It wasn't. The silence that followed felt heavy. Mom scoffed slightly. You're being dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply stood there calmly. I spent years trying to prove I wasn't the failure you said I was, I continued. Emma's eyes flicked toward me briefly. And now suddenly everyone wants to celebrate. Mom rolled her eyes. Oh please, she said. That's not what this is about. Then apologize. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she crossed her arms tighter. I'm not apologizing for parenting, she said firmly. The moment hung in the air. A single choice had been placed in front of her. Pride. Or accountability. And she had chosen. I nodded slowly. Okay. Emma looked up quickly. Wet. But I had already picked up my bag. Mom frowned. What are you doing? I looked at her one last time. Then I'm not paying for anything. Emma's eyes widened. You're serious. Very. Daniel opened his mouth like he wanted to say something but quickly thought better of it. Mom's voice sharpened. You're really going to abandon your family over a joke? I paused near the door. Then I turned slightly. No, I said calmly. I'm finally choosing myself. 3 months passed faster than I expected. Life had a strange way of moving forward, once you stop standing in the same painful place. The day I walked out of my childhood house with my bag over my shoulder, I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel victorious either. Mostly I felt something quiet and unfamiliar. Relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my family to approve of me. I wasn't hoping they would suddenly change. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Instead, my days filled with things that actually mattered to me. Meetings about the future of the software I had built. Conversations with engineers who wanted to improve it. Planning sessions for the next phase of my career. And something that quickly became the most meaningful project I had ever started. The foundation. The idea had come to me during a late night in my office, a few weeks after the deal was finalized. I had been thinking about all the girls who sat in their bedrooms, like I once did, staring at a computer screen while people around them dismissed their interests as strange or pointless. Girls who loved technology but were told it wasn't normal. Girls who were laughed at for being quiet, analytical, or different. I knew exactly how that felt, so I decided to do something about it. The foundation started small on paper, but quickly grew into something bigger than I expected. Its mission was simple: provide scholarships and mentorship for young women who wanted to study programming, engineering, or technology, but didn't have the support to pursue it. Within the first month, we funded 20 students. By the second month, it was 50. By the third month, we had reached 100 scholarships. Each time I read one of the application letters, it felt like looking into a mirror from the past. Stories about teachers who didn't take them seriously, families who pushed them toward more acceptable careers, friends who didn't understand why they preferred coding over parties. But every letter also contained something else: determination. The same quiet stubbornness that had carried me through years of doubt. Helping them felt more rewarding than any headline about money or acquisitions. One afternoon, while reviewing a list of new applicants in my office, my assistant knocked gently on the door. "You might want to see this," she said. She held up a tablet. On the screen were wedding photos, Emma's wedding. I hadn't expected to see them, but apparently someone from our extended family had posted them online, and the images were now circulating through social media. The ceremony looked nice. Simple, but nice. A small outdoor venue decorated with white flowers and strings of lights. Emma stood at the center of the photos in a dress that was elegant, but clearly not the extravagant one she had originally planned. Daniel looked happy standing beside her. In the background, I spotted my mother smiling brightly for the camera. For a moment I studied the images quietly. There was a time when missing my sister's wedding would have broken my heart. But now the feeling was different. Not sadness. Just distance. Like watching a movie about people I used to know. My assistant waited politely before asking, "Family?" "Something like that?" I said with a faint smile. Later that evening, after finishing a few more emails, I was preparing to leave the office when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made me pause. Mom. It had been weeks since her last message. I stared at the phone while it continued ringing. A part of me wondered what she would say this time. Maybe she wanted money again. Maybe she wanted to pretend the argument never happened. Maybe she had finally decided to apologize. But as I looked at the screen, something became very clear. The answer didn't actually matter anymore. I let the phone ring until it stopped. A few seconds later another call came through. I declined it. The silence that followed felt calm, not tense. Some bridges don't collapse in dramatic explosions. They simply stop being crossed. I slipped my phone into my bag and walked toward the large windows at the far side of my office. Outside, the city glowed with thousands of lights as evening settled in. Cars moved like streams of red and white across the streets below, and the distant sound of traffic hummed softly through the glass. 3 years ago, I had been a girl sitting alone in her bedroom, while people laughed about how she would never succeed. Now I stood in an office overlooking a city, running projects that could change lives. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to stay small. I thought back to the moment at the airport when the airline employee told me my ticket had been canceled. The text message from my mother. "Have fun walking home, loser." At the time it had stung. But now the memory felt almost ironic, because that moment had marked the end of something. The end of waiting for permission. The end of trying to earn respect from people who had already decided not to give it. I walked back to my desk and picked up one of the scholarship acceptance letters. It was from a 17-year-old girl who had taught herself programming using free online tutorials because her school didn't offer computer science classes. Her final sentence caught my eye again. "Everyone thinks I'm weird for loving this stuff, but I know it's what I want to do." I smiled softly. Somewhere out there, another underestimated girl was starting her journey. And maybe, years from now, she would stand exactly where I was standing. Proof that being underestimated isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning of something unstoppable. The girl my mother once called a loser didn't walk home from the airport. She built something worth $78 million. And then she built something even more valuable. A future that belonged entirely to her.